started with a number that shouldn't exist, 5,200 years. That is how old the stone structure at Newgrange, Ireland, actually is. A monument so old that it predates Stonehenge by roughly 1,000 years and predates the Great Pyramid of Giza by several centuries. Here is the part almost nobody tells you. Newgrange was not discovered by archaeologists. It was found completely by accident in 1699, when a landowner named Charles Campbell needed stones to build a road and sent workers to dig into what looked like an ordinary grassy hill in County Meath. What they hit, instead, was a wall of white quartz and a passage leading into darkness that had not seen daylight in over 5,000 years. Think about what that means. For 5 millennia, an entire chamber built by human hands sat sealed beneath a mound of earth, undisturbed, unrobbed, unknown, while entire civilizations rose and collapsed above it. The Celts arrived, the Vikings raided the coastline just a few miles away, the Normans built castles nearby, and none of them ever found the door. But here's where it gets worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. Because when archaeologists finally excavated the site properly in the 1960s, led by a professor named Michael J. O'Kelly, they didn't just find an old tomb, they found something that shouldn't have been possible for a Stone Age society. Above the entrance to the passage, there is a small rectangular opening, now known as the roof box. For centuries, nobody understood its purpose. It looked almost decorative. Then, in December of 1967, O'Kelly did something nobody had thought to do. He waited inside the tomb, alone before sunrise on the winter solstice, just to see what would happen. What happened became one of the most quoted moments in the history of archaeology, because it turned an old pile of stone into evidence of something far more calculated. As the sun rose over the horizon that morning, a beam of light entered through that roof box, traveled down a 19-meter passage in complete darkness, and illuminated the floor of the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes, before retreating and vanishing for another year. Not close, not roughly aligned, precisely calibrated, down to the angle of the passage floor, rising slightly toward the back so the light wouldn't be blocked by dust or debris over the centuries. This is not chaos. This is strategy. Somebody, 5,000 years ago, understood the mechanics of Earth's tilt and orbit well enough to build a permanent stone instrument that still works today, without a single adjustment, without a single repair to its core alignment. And this is where everything changes, because once you understand that this wasn't just a burial mound but a functioning solar machine, you have to ask an uncomfortable question. Who were the people capable of building it? According to the archaeological record, the Newgrange builders had no bronze, no iron, no writing system we've ever found, and yet they moved over 200,000 tons of material, including massive curbstones weighing several tons each, some of which were transported from sources many kilometers away. One particular stone, the Greywacke used for some of the carved curbstones, has been traced to the Wicklow Mountains, roughly 40 kilometers south. Others came from as far as the Mourne Mountains in modern-day Northern Ireland. Think about what that logistics operation actually required. No wheels, no horses domesticated for that kind of labor yet in Ireland, no cranes. Just rollers, ropes, timber, manpower, and an engineering plan precise enough that the whole structure has survived intact through 50 centuries of Irish rain, frost, and wind without a single structural collapse. What most people are not seeing when they picture ancient people as primitive is that Newgrange's roof is not simple stacked rock. It uses a technique called corbelling, where each ring of stone is laid slightly overlapping the one below it, curving inward until the chamber closes into a peak, 6 meters above the floor. And in over 5,000 years, through storms, through freeze-thaw cycles that crack modern concrete, that roof has never once let rainwater leak into the tomb. Modern engineers who have studied the site have openly admitted that the drainage system built into the corbelled roof, subtle grooves cut into the underside of the stones to channel water outward rather than inward, demonstrates a level of hydraulic understanding that has no clear precedent in the archaeological timeline. There is no earlier structure in Ireland or Britain that explains where this knowledge came from. It appears, fully formed, in one of the oldest buildings on the continent, but the roof and the light beam were never the part that shook the archaeological world the hardest. That came much later, in 2020, when a team of geneticists published a study in the journal Nature that took the mystery in a direction nobody expected. They had extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from human remains found deep inside the Newgrange chamber, remains that had lain there since the tomb's original use. What the DNA revealed was not what anyone predicted. The man whose remains were tested was the product of a first-degree incestuous relationship, meaning either a parent and child or full siblings. In most ancient societies, this kind of pairing is documented almost exclusively among ruling elites attempting to preserve bloodline purity and consolidate power, the same pattern seen in ancient Egyptian, Incan, and Hawaiian royal dynasties thousands of years later and thousands of miles away. Read that again. A Stone Age farming community in Ireland, with no writing, no known kings, no recorded political structure, may have practiced the exact same incestuous succession strategy that later fully developed empires used to secure divine kingship. This is where the story stops being about architecture and starts being about power, because if the Newgrange builders had a ruling elite important enough to justify incestuous unions to preserve bloodline, then Newgrange itself was never just a communal tomb. It was very likely the resting place of a dynasty, a family that positioned itself quite literally at the center of the solar calendar, controlling the one moment each year when light entered the underworld. Whoever controlled that ritual controlled the community's understanding of time, of the seasons, of when to plant and when to harvest. In a farming society, that kind of control is not symbolic. It is absolute. It means the difference between survival and starvation, and the people who built Newgrange placed themselves physically and spiritually at the mechanism of that control. And here's where it gets even stranger, because Newgrange was never alone. It sits within a landscape called Brú na Boine, a bend in the River Boyne that also contains two other massive passage tombs, Noth and Douth, along with dozens of smaller mounds, standing stones, and enclosures. Noth, in particular, holds the single largest collection of megalithic art found anywhere in Western Europe, with over 300 decorated stones carved with spirals, lozenges, and radial patterns whose exact meaning remains unresolved. Some researchers have proposed that certain spiral carvings at Noth may represent lunar cycles rather than solar ones, meaning the two tombs, Newgrange and Noth, might have functioned as a paired observatory system, one calibrated to the sun, the other to the moon. If that theory holds, and it remains actively debated, it would mean this valley in rural Ireland once operated as one of the most sophisticated combined solar-lunar monitoring complexes in the ancient world, built roughly 1,000 years before the pyramids and predating any comparable structure in mainland Europe. But think about what that means for how we've been taught to see prehistoric Europe. The traditional narrative, the one most people grew up with, treats ancient Ireland as a cultural backwater, a remote island on the edge of the known world, overshadowed by the civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and later Greece and Rome. What the Boyne Valley complex quietly suggests is the opposite. It suggests that complex, centralized, astronomically literate societies existed in Ireland before the pyramids were even conceived, and that they were sophisticated enough to coordinate multi-generational construction projects requiring stable governance, food surplus, specialized labor, and inherited institutional knowledge passed down without writing. That is not the profile of scattered hunter-gatherer bands. That is the profile of an early state. So here is the uncomfortable escalation. If Ireland had this level of organized society by 3200 BC, why does it vanish so completely from what came after? Because that's exactly what happens. By around 2900 BC, construction at Brú na Boine appears to slow and eventually stop. The Great Passage tombs go quiet. No comparable megalithic project of that scale is ever attempted again in Ireland. Some archaeologists point to climate shifts, cooling and increased rainfall around that period, which would have devastated the surplus agriculture needed to sustain large construction labor forces. Others point to social collapse. Perhaps the very dynasty whose incestuous bloodline built Newgrange eventually destabilized itself, the way concentrated hereditary power so often does when it prioritizes bloodline purity over competent succession. Either way, something happened that we still cannot fully reconstruct, and the silence in the archaeological record afterward is almost as loud as the monument itself. What most people are not seeing is that the story doesn't end with abandonment. It continues, quietly for thousands of years, in the folklore of the very people who eventually settled the same valley. Newgrange was reincorporated into Irish mythology by the Celts, who arrived over 2,000 years after its builders were gone, absorbed into the legend of the Tuatha De Danann, a supernatural race said to have ruled Ireland before retreating into the Hollow Hills, or Seed, becoming the Aos Si, the fairy folk of later Irish tradition. In these myths, Newgrange itself became known as the dwelling of Angus, god of love and youth, and of the Dagda, one of the chief gods of the old pantheon, described as a figure of immense strength, who possessed a magical cauldron that never ran empty. Think about what it means that a structure built by a completely different forgotten culture was later reinterpreted by an entirely separate people as the literal home of their gods. The Celts who arrived in Ireland had no idea who actually built Newgrange. They looked at a 5,000-year-old feat of engineering, one they themselves could not replicate, and the only explanation their worldview could offer was that it must have been built by gods because no mortal hands, as far as they knew, could have done it. And this is where the deeper unease sets in, because that same instinct, the instinct to attribute what we cannot explain to something beyond ourselves, has never actually gone away. It's simply changed shape. In the 20th and 21st centuries, that same unexplainable gap in the archaeological record has been filled by an entirely different set of stories, ones involving ancient astronauts, lost advanced civilizations, and secret chambers still waiting to be found beneath Irish hillsides. According to informed sources within the archaeological community, and this is something researchers have raised with real frustration, the genuine mysteries of sites like Newgrange, the unanswered questions about the builders' identity, their astronomical knowledge, their political structure, their sudden decline, are compelling enough on their own. They don't need fabrication. But because official excavation is slow, funding is limited, and full answers may never come, the vacuum left by legitimate uncertainty gets filled instead by viral misinformation, invented stories of hidden vaults, and ancient technology that spread faster online than the real, verified findings ever could. That tension between real mystery and manufactured mystery is not new either. Newgrange itself was partially reconstructed in the 1970s, and its famous white quartz facade, the one seen in nearly every photograph of the site today, is itself a point of ongoing controversy. O'Kelly's team found quartz stones scattered around the base of the mound during excavation and made the decision to reconstruct a standing quartz wall at the front entrance, based on their best interpretation of how the stones had originally been used. But here's what most tourists are never told when they visit. Some archaeologists have argued for decades that this reconstruction may not accurately represent the tomb's original appearance at all, that the quartz might have originally been laid flat, spread across the mound like a cairn rather than stacked vertically like a wall. If that's true, then one of the most photographed monuments in Ireland, the postcard image recognized around the world, maybe in its most visible detail, an educated guess dressed up as certainty. And once you know that, you start to wonder how many other facts about ancient sites are really just confident reconstructions built on incomplete evidence. This is where the modern chapter of the story becomes almost as strange as the ancient one. In the past decade, new non-invasive survey technology, particularly lidar laser mapping and ground-penetrating radar, has revealed that the three famous tombs, Newgrange, Knowth, and Dowth, were never an isolated trio sitting quietly in a field. Surveys conducted in the wider Brú-na-Bóinne landscape have detected the outlines of previously unknown structures buried beneath the soil, including massive circular enclosures, or henges, some of them larger in diameter than Stonehenge's outer ring, along with a huge timber and stone monument sometimes referred to informally as an ancient woodhenge, and further ceremonial pathways connecting sites that were previously assumed to stand alone. None of these newly detected structures have been fully excavated. Most exist only as shadows and radar data, geometric outlines with no confirmed contents, no confirmed age, and no confirmed purpose, which means the most honest, most current answer to what is actually buried in the fields around Newgrange is that nobody knows yet, and the full picture of this landscape, even after 3 centuries of study, is still being drawn. Consider the scale of what that actually implies. We are talking about one of the most intensively studied archaeological landscapes in Europe, protected by UNESCO World Heritage status since 1993, visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists every year, subjected to decades of excavation, dating, DNA analysis, and digital mapping, and there are still entire structures sitting beneath the grass that we have detected but never opened. Every layer that gets uncovered seems to generate more questions than it resolves. We now know the builders had advanced astronomical knowledge. We don't know how they acquired it or transmitted it across generations without writing. We now know there was likely a ruling bloodline practicing dynastic incest. We don't know their names, their language, or what finally ended their rule. We now know there are additional monumental structures buried nearby. We don't know what's inside them or whether opening them will answer old questions or simply create new ones. And that uncertainty is precisely why this landscape refuses to fade from public fascination, even 5,000 years after it was built. It sits at the exact intersection of everything that keeps people awake at night wondering about the past. Proof that ancient people were far more capable than we tend to assume, physical evidence of secretive elite power structures hidden from ordinary observers, a documented history of the site being deliberately reinterpreted and mythologized by later cultures who didn't understand it either, and now, unresolved radar data hinting that we still haven't found everything that's there. Every single element of that combination is independently verified. None of it needs to be invented, and that, in the end, might be the most unsettling realization of all. That the true story buried in an Irish hillside is stranger, older, and less finished than most of the invented stories circulating about it today. So the real question isn't whether something shocking is hiding beneath Ireland's ancient stones. Something already has been found, and it has been reshaping our understanding of prehistoric Europe for over half a century. The real question is, what happens when archaeologists finally excavate those newly detected henges and buried structures still sitting untouched beneath the fields of the Boyne Valley? Will they confirm that this valley was once the political and spiritual center of an entire prehistoric civilization we've barely begun to understand? Will the next set of remains carry the same startling genetic signature of dynastic power found in 2020? Or will they reveal something that doesn't fit any existing theory at all, forcing historians to rewrite, once again, what they thought they knew about the people who lived in Ireland before history began keeping score? Nobody currently has that answer. The ground is still there. The radar images are still unexplained. And somewhere beneath that quiet Irish countryside, the next chapter of this story is still waiting, sealed, for someone to finally dig deep enough to find it.